it's likely that most participants will understand what I will be saying. And so this way, they can only be familiar with some concepts related to public health and related to the idea of conceptualizing health in war. So what I would like to do is begin by saying that the Institute of Community and Public Health has for quite a while been grappling with the notion of how to reconceptualize health in ways which are not purely biomedical. Biomedicine is necessary but not sufficient. However, from our experience in living war-like conditions for so long, we know that biomedicine fails to come to grips with what really happens to people in war, what happens to their lives in war, and how does war affect ultimately health status before disease sets in. Because in public health, and our multidisciplinary public health entails the very important idea of prevention. So what we need to do is be able to grasp, capture what happens to people before disease sets in. The other reason why we were dissatisfied with conceptualizations of health in war is that we were being pathologized left, right, and center. So for example, during the second uprising, people were discussing the traumas of children in Gaza, and they were saying 96% of children in the Gaza Strip have PTSD. And I used to say, my goodness, so 96% are mad? Doesn't make sense. These are children who are experiencing natural reactions to trauma, which will heal in community. It doesn't mean that they are pathologically sick or something like that. So it is from this perspective where we have come to understand health in a slightly different way. Basically, people oscillate between ease and dis-ease over the life course, over this continuum. Disease is the end stage of this continuum. The ease is the best stage in this continuum, and we usually are in between, oscillating back and forth on this line, depending on insult, its severity, its chronicity, etc. And of course, on the resources that are available to us to heal. This is a key issue. It's not black and white. It is not dichotomous. It is a continuum over the life course, which can affect people by getting them eventually sick if they are not dealt with before disease sets in. Now, the other thing that is important is that people, when they oscillate between the disease continuum, do not oscillate in a straight line. We do not live in vectors. We live in a mess, as you can see right now, with back and forth effects, back and forth. Here you have insults and then resources, more insults, more resources, etc. And if the total sum of insults exceeds resources, and if their intensity and severity is high, then of course we can get to the disease stage. That's the other rule of thumb about understanding health and disease. Health is not about sickness, it's about a continuum which ranges from ease all the way to disease. And I would like to remind you of our grandparents who used to provide us with idioms related to their health in Arabic that reflect this continuum. For example, and I'll say these things in Arabic that I've been collecting for quite a while, also with students. For example, how is your health today? مش قادرة, unable. How's your health today? مش مبسوطة, not happy. In our health, traditional health, Arabic system of knowledge, we do not separate the physical from the psychological. That's why we say أنا مش مبسوطة اليوم. I do not feel happy today, but it means that both physical and mental health are a problem. Also social health. We can say مجعلكة, wrinkled. We can say مستوية, cooked. We can say all sorts of idioms, which eventually people then say they are sick, مريض, and when they say they are مريض, usually it means that they have been diagnosed by a doctor. This is a key point. It's part of our tradition to think of health and disease in a continuum. However, we unfortunately were all trained in thinking of dichotomies, and whereby either you're healthy or you're sick, and it doesn't work that way. And that is why we began to rethink and reconceptualize health in war and beyond. I think at this stage, it's about health given all sorts of structural violence factors that can affect health negatively. So, objective measures, what is called objective measures of health. Okay, they are called objective, but I'm not so sure they are objective, because there are ranges, and ranges change from race to culture, etc. But let us call them objective. And yes, they are necessary, but far from sufficient. And we have death, injury, disability, disease. And that's not the only thing that happens in warlike conditions or in conflict or under chronic structural violence. There is a range of other issues that we need to look at. This death, injury, disability, disease relies primarily on counting dead bodies, for example, yet the dead are 100% dead. What we need to do is pay attention to the living and stop them from getting into the disease stage. So objective measures of health are good, are necessary, but they are not sufficient. We need many other types of measures to be able to understand what happens to people under structural violence, etc. Especially now with COVID, this is more relevant than ever before. That's why we have developed at ICPH a suffering domain. And within the suffering domain, we have been developing metrics, measures for exposure to political and other forms of violence. We have finished that metric. Human insecurity, we've completed this metric. They're also published, they're all found on our website. Ambiguity, uncertainty, we are in the process of completing qualitative work in order to build a scale to measure uncertainty. And uncertainty these days is quite important when it comes to COVID. Everything is uncertain, except that in the Palestinian context, we have a double captivity. We are uncertain because of COVID, but we are uncertain because of Israeli military rule of the West Bank. Humiliation, we've developed a measure for that. Deprivation, it's in its final paper is being produced. Silencing, we haven't even started that. Violation of human rights, this links very much to what we're trying to do here. And what we would like to do is develop a measure for the type of violations of human rights that happen in the occupied Palestinian territories, West Bank, Gaza Strip, including East Jerusalem, and then measure the effect of such violations on health status. And we will be doing that, I hope, by next year. Then what we do, what we have is also subjective measures of health. What are these subjective measures of health? To let you know that these subjective measures of health are known in the literature to predict death and disease. And I don't know why they call them subjective. I think maybe because they rely on the reports of people themselves rather than a diagnosis from the physician. But reports of people themselves need to be part of the diagnosis precisely because such voices can predict disease and death, as we know from the literature repeatedly. And such subjective measures include the WHO well-being index, which we've used quite a bit and works very well here. quality of life of WHO, which didn't work very well because our uncertainty and insecurity measures were more sensitive to change in the Gaza Strip before and after the 2009 war. So quality of life was not so good. Self-rated health, excellent. Distress, we have developed a distress measure here because distress manifests itself differently in different contexts and cultures. And then there are the physical and somatization and psychological and behavioral complaints, all important to include as subjective measures. And we too have developed these physical, somatization, psychological, and behavioral symptoms related to health. And also our partners, and we worked with them, they have developed a measure on feeling broken or destroyed, a very important psychological notion, which is measurable. In Arabic, it is mhattam. Everybody knows what mhattam is. When you are mhattam, you're really in very bad shape. Now, so we have objective, we have subjective, we have suffering, and now what we're saying is that WHO did very well with its social determinants of health, the conditions in which people are born, grow, live, and age. However, we believe that ultimately these social determinants of health are ultimately influenced. The ultimate determinant of those are the political determinants of health. And the political determinants of health are wars, conflicts, biopower, and biopolitics. For example, Israel exercises biopower and biopolitics by putting people in prison. So it's controlling of their bodies through their power, putting them in prison in order not to do whatever. Necropolitics, this comes from Bembe, a famous African philosopher and intellectual. Necropolitics is deciding who will live and who will die. Racism is a very important political determinant of health. And now with COVID-19, it's quite clear that racism is a major issue related to why some people seem to die and have this disease more than others, groups of people. Distribution of power and money, of course. Patriarchy, how it affects. Patriarchy affects not only women, but also young men. The patriarch is the senior in the family who decides what women and young people have to do. And so patriarchy is also a system of domination and a political determinant of health. Global market forces, for example, neoliberalism, open markets, no control by government, let the market do its thing, and it doesn't matter what happens to people because the main issue is to make money and more money. Global and country-specific policies which discriminate against all sorts of groups and, for example, do not acknowledge citizens' rights. For example, the social contract between state and citizen, which allows for social protection and health protection, international conflict, and even factionalism. For example, in the case of Palestinians, factionalism has been a problematic component which is negatively influencing our health. Now, these political determinants of health influence the social determinants. All of the above can create the conditions in which people are born, grow, and live and age in terms of being good conditions for health or bad conditions for health. And of course, there is something called biological predisposition. Some people are more prone because of familial reasons, genetics, to, for example, have heart disease, diabetes, and others. So we cannot neglect the biological predisposition, but we need to put it in its place. These are all the different types of determinants of health that we have been developing. And so finally, take a look at this. You have objective measures of health they influence the suffering domain, and the suffering domain influences the objective measures of health. I want to remove, yes. Subjective measures of health influence objective measures, and at the same time influence suffering. Suffering can be due to political determinants, but the political determinants can influence suffering some more, and so on and so forth. What you see here is a relation between all of these domains, with the center being called political determinants of health. The reason why we say one influences the other is two notions in medicine and biology that we know very well. One of them is called feedback loop. And the feedback loop is what you know already. It's the fight or flight phenomenon. For example, where you are under great danger and you feel it, you produce norepinephrine. So you can run, and save yourself. And then after this is over, you are exhausted. It's feedback loop. And you are so tired, you might get sick. So that's one aspect. That's why the interrelation is important. The other one is that we know now that chronic exposure to certain or to violence, to all these forms of violence, can produce gene alteration in people, whereby that new gene is handed on from generation to generation to produce illness. Yes, to produce illness. I guess this is it. This is our conceptual framework, which will link very nicely to what Ben will be talking about right now, because he will be speaking about the broader determinants, which are a complement really to the determinants that we have just described. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Rita. Sorry, Rima.